Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening to some people. Welcome to our webinar presentation of Work, Family, and Social Protection, a launch of a current report by HelpAge International, funded by the UNFPA. This webinar is titled Old Age Social Protection in Aging Asia, Current Trends and Future Directions. With me, we have Charles Knox-Vidmanoff of HelpAge International. Charles is a social protection advisor at HelpAge International and is involved in direct support and training of government and supporting HelpAge offices and networks globally. He has written extensively on social pensions and worked across the world and advocating for social pensions and old age income security. Our second participant today will be Basil Conker. Basil is professor of economics at the University of Dhaka. His areas of expertise are economy and poverty and income distribution impacts of tax policy. Basil will be delivering, you will not have a presentation per se from Basil, but a sort of presentation of findings through. So there are no slides for Basil's presentation. Our next participant is Lisa Hannigan, who will be presenting last. Lisa is Director of the Poverty and Social Transfer Section in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in Australia. She's part of the social protection team that facilitates South-South events in the areas where countries most directly benefit from learning. I will let Charles take over and introduce the report and a bit more about himself if he likes. So thank you very much. Charles, would you like to take over, please?
Yeah. Well, good day, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Today I'm going to focus on presenting this new report we have on work, family, and social protection. Maybe just to give a bit of background on myself, I'm a social protection policy advisor at HelpAge International, based in London, but involved in supporting our offices and network and other stakeholders around the world on social protection policy, and unsurprisingly, a big focus of HelpAge's work on social protection is around old age. So maybe just to start by giving a little bit of background on the report. As Dan mentioned, this was a partnership between HelpAge and UNFPA, United Nations Population Fund in Asia. And when we were kind of thinking through this research, where there was a real kind of interest in income security, the starting point, the kind of key question we really had was what exactly happens to an individual's income as they reach older ages. And that's really the starting point for the thinking of the research and what we've been trying to explore. Now, I mean, that question, looking at what happens to a person's income, is perhaps a little bit different from how we often phrase the question as, what's the situation of older people, in that we're taking a bit more of a life course approach, trying to understand that older people are people who were once younger, and also more of an intergenerational approach of trying to kind of pull out some of the interactions between older people and other members of their families, other members of their household. So why did we as HelpAge and UNFPA think this was a question of interest? Well, I think there are a kind of couple of big trends which make the question particularly pertinent at the moment. One, and a trend which this audience I think will be more familiar with, is the rise in social protection in the Asia region and obviously the globe over the last 10 to 20 years. And within that, including within the Asia region, a big part of that have been different kinds of schemes which have been introduced for older people. So by exploring the income security of older people, we're trying to understand a little bit more the context for those reforms, how those changes might be influencing those decisions, and also to understand the extent to which those new initiatives are having an impact on older people. So go to the next slide. Now the second trend, which some of you may be a little bit less familiar with, is really that the Asia region in particular, I mean all countries in the world really, but particularly in the Asia region, there's already a rapid process of aging of the population already underway. So what this chart shows is the proportion of the population of the 5 countries we focused on here over the age of 60 in 2016 and in 2040. And what we see is over the next 25 years, there's going to be a really rapid increase in the proportion of people who are in this age group. So we see in Bangladesh an increase from just around 7% of the population, 60 plus, to 27% in 2040. Similarly, significant increases in Nepal and Vietnam and Thailand. Not quite as extreme in the Philippines, but still significant. So really, within a relatively short time period, we're going to see a very extreme change in the demographics of these countries, which means very rapidly, while in most of these countries around 10% or less of the population is 60 plus today, suddenly this population, the older population, is going to become bigger, and these questions of of income security in old age are going to become even more relevant than they are today. So moving to the next slide. So in tackling this, basically this report tries to unpack in some more detail, what is the nature of the different kinds of income sources that older people receive. And we focused on 3, which are work, labour income, income that would be received from families, and social protection. Now there is, in general, these are kind of 3 of the main ones. There is a 4th that's often discussed in more detail, which is income from assets and savings, for various methodological reasons, and also because we couldn't see it coming out as particularly significant within the data. We haven't explored that issue here in great detail. So we focused on these 3 areas of income: work, income from family, and social protection. Now this approach of trying to kind of unpack and look at the nature and interactions of these different sources of income is a bit different from how issues of old age income security and poverty are often measured. Often a kind of default way to look at this issue is simply to look at old age poverty as it's defined, which in reality it usually means taking household survey data, poverty analysis from this data, and disaggregating it by age. Now that's a useful way that can have some value in shedding light on the situation of older people. However, because it's based on household data and not individual level data, it's often quite difficult to interpret, and it's difficult to unpack what is the extent to which you're picking up the situation of a household or the situation of an individual. So this analysis aims to dig a bit deeper, look more specifically at the older person and the kinds of income that they are receiving. Now just to very briefly talk about how we did the research, what I'm presenting today was very much a team effort which involved quite a significant number of people. In each country, the approach we used was to have country-level teams of researchers who we felt would have better access to the data and also understand the data and the context so that they could analyze it appropriately. Now, Baz Lul, who is on the panel today, was one of the lead researchers, was the lead researcher for Bangladesh. So it's great to have him here. And we also had an international analyst, Bjorn Gelders of Development Pathways, who oversaw and tried to was wading through the issues of comparability of data, which is far from a simple task. And the researchers, the approach was not to do new surveys, new data collection. The idea was really to use existing data, particularly household surveys, labour force surveys, and surveys of older people, but analyse them in new ways to see what new findings we could come up. So in a sense, it's an exercise to see how far we can kind of squeeze the existing data sets and pull out the issues relating to old age that may not have been published or analysed before. Now I'm going to, in the discussion, work through these 3 areas, but I'm going to focus particularly on social protection, given that the webinar is on socialprotection.org. So yeah, moving on to the next slide. So starting with work and old age, what are some of the main headlines? Now I think the biggest headline is perhaps to emphasize that the situation of older people in terms of work, paid work this is, employment, and the income they get from that is quite mixed and it's quite complex. And it's important to try and find a middle ground between often quite kind of, extreme generalizations about work in old age, particularly in low and middle income countries like the ones we're looking at here. So on one hand, in policy discussions, there can be a tendency to almost assume that everyone over age 60, age 65 is economically inactive, sometimes slightly inheriting the kind of narratives and policy discussions from OECD countries where labour force participation in old age is quite low. However, when we look at the working patterns in these 5 countries, we find that actually quite a significant proportion of older people over the age of 60 and even at higher ages are still employed and earning income. And so the chart to the left here shows this, that in 4 of the 5 countries, Thailand, Vietnam, Bangladesh and the Philippines, roughly 40% of older people age 60 and over are in employment. And that's even higher, 66% in Nepal. However, while that's the case, and while older people do continue to work, there's a clear trend that older ages are associated with lower levels of work. And this is shown quite clearly in the chart to the right. Now the chart to the right shows levels of employment, the proportion of the population employed by 5-year age group, all the way from age 15 to 85 plus. And we've kind of grayed in the area which is 60 plus. So what you see is within this 60 plus age group, there's an extreme diversity. If we take a country like Nepal, at age 60 to 65, 80% of older people are working, which is quite comparable to people of younger ages. But this falls to somewhere around 20% once people get into their 80s. So there's a clear trend that at older ages work is clearly much more challenging, and people are withdrawing from the workforce, which again is a bit of a warning not to then go to the extreme in the narrative of as is often presented, that older people work until they die. Well, it seems even in a very resource-poor setting such as Nepal, many people are withdrawing from the workforce at older ages. And we also find when we look at the hours of work, how many hours spent working, these do also reduce perhaps less significantly, but do gradually reduce at older ages. Now the main reason for this that comes through from the data is really health issues, and that comes up as the most prominent. So I think we're seeing that issues of health are making it much harder to work at older ages, which won't, I assume, be a great surprise to this audience. Now I'm not going to discuss these in great detail, but just to flag a few other findings on the employment side, and I don't have slides on this. One is that there's obviously a significant gender dimension to work in old age. As with all ages really, in these countries, women are less likely to work than men for a number of cultural labour force reasons. The reasons which they say they are not working are also quite different from men, particularly women in their early 60s and early to late 60s. They're much more likely to say, and a large portion in all of the countries where we have data are saying the reason they're not working is actually family responsibilities rather than health. That changes at older ages. But that's quite an interesting trend, that particularly for older women out of the workforce, those family responsibilities seem to be the primary driver for many rather than health issues. And a final thing to flag is that another thing we're able to pull out is that those who continue to work into old age are often those who are actually most vulnerable, and we get a sense of those without any other choice. So when you look at those people who are working in old age, they're much more likely to be in the informal sector, they're much more likely to be in the agricultural sector than people of younger ages. So the work that people are doing in old age is, on average, more vulnerable. Now that's potentially due to 2 trends. One, that those people who that it's the people who continue to work are those that were in those sectors, though we do also see trends in a number of countries of people who used to be in the formal sector moving to more vulnerable sectors in old age because they can't get the same work they had before. Okay, so moving on to the next slide. So yeah, moving on to the second area, income from family. Now, again, I think a common assumption in most of the countries that HelpAge works, and also, I mean, particularly I think in the Asia region, is that, you know, accepting that work it does become more challenging in old age. The assumption is that you know, the family are those that fill the gap in terms of providing income for older people. And I think it's worth by noting, you know, this is true to an extent. And one thing that comes out very clearly from both the data and, you know, various other analysis that's been done in these countries and others within the Asia region is that older people are actually part of quite complex, kind of complex web, a complex network of transfers that are moving through the family. So, you know, and this works both ways. So, you know, older people receive income from their children, which may be in terms of transfers, it may be, you know, cash is given, it may be food is provided, etc., etc. But conversely, older people in many contexts are also significant providers of cash and support to others when they have it. In fact, one of something which I think we are seeing increasing evidence around recently, and which relates to the later part of this presentation, is that when social pensions and other kind of pension income exists and older people are receiving this income, in a sense they are much more likely to be net contributors to their family network than net recipients, which is what is more likely to happen if they don't have any kind of pension income. Now, I mean, just to give a kind of flavour from these countries about some of the headlines in terms of family support. Now, one thing is that to emphasise is many older people, virtually all of them are likely to have children, you know, in these countries, either in their own household or somewhere else. So we find in Thailand and Vietnam, 9 in 10 older people have at least one living child. And around 70% of older people receive income from children. So it's quite a common thing that some form of income is received. And I would also emphasize, I think this is an important aspect, is that, you know, this isn't just about income that works within the household. We talk a lot about household poverty, we talk a lot about intra-household transfers, but often older people may be receiving income from other households, be them in the same village, in the same region of a country, or within the same country, or even beyond through different forms of remittances. So moving on to the next slide. So while we see that these forms of transfers are quite common and most people receive some kind of support, there seem to be major questions around whether this support is adequate, and some quite strong indicators that it is often not. So the left chart actually shows, for 3 countries where we have data, what older people report as their main source of income. And we find that while children, which is that orange section, are often quite a significant source of income, around 30% of older people say it's their main source. Actually, for most older people, it's other sources of income which are more significant, be it work, which is really the most prominent one, social protection, or other forms of income. And so here we do get this picture. Yes, families are important, but to generalize that, you know, families are the main source of support for the majority of older people is not quite accurate, at least in these countries. Similarly, we also looked at remittances and found that while, you know, a fairly decent share of older people, depending on country, the country live in a household that receives remittances, you know, the majority in many cases don't receive remittances. So, so seeing that as the kind of the magic bullet for addressing old age income security is quite limited. Even in a country like the Philippines, you know, in terms of international remittances, only around 20% of older people receive them. And we also find that it's actually that tends to be the relatively better off older people that receive those remittances rather than the poorest. Now, I think an important point to emphasize, which is flagged with the quote from the infographic on the right, is that this isn't about families just being stingy and uncaring for their older relatives. And one thing that comes out a lot from the qualitative work that we've seen done throughout the region is really the limits of family support come in the context of widespread poverty and vulnerability of the broader families that older people are a part of, and a context where these families are struggling with competing priorities, whether it's sending kids to school, whether it's investing in household livelihoods. And in that list, the extent to which support can be provided to older people is often quite limited. Okay, moving on to the next slide. So in this context of the challenges of work, limits of family support, how is social protection? How are social protection systems doing in filling that gap? And I'm going to look a little bit at coverage, adequacy, and some of the kind of options and how affordable it would be to expand these systems. So this slide shows some indications on the coverage of systems and looks at what share of older people are receiving different kinds of pensions in the 5 countries. And what we see as highlighted in the dark red is in 4 of the 5 countries, roughly a half of older people or less receive no pension at all. The exception is Thailand, where that figure is just 9%. Just 9% of older people are receiving no pension. Yeah, in that context, the vast majority are receiving a social pension. So how do those different kinds of pensions, how are they faring? Well, starting off with earnings-related pensions. I've called them earnings-related pensions here rather than contributory pensions, which is often the term used, partly because, as I'm going to discuss in a few moments, many of these contributory schemes are actually financed by taxes. So while they're often linked to work history and having worked in a particular sector, actually no contributions are actually made formally. Now, the status of contributory pensions in these countries is most of them over the last decades really have struggled to cover a large share of the older population. And the most successful is really the Philippines, where around roughly a third of older people receive some kind of contributory pension, with figures much lower in Thailand and Bangladesh and the other countries in the middle. And this really reflects a global trend found in other low and middle income countries around the challenges of contributory and earnings-related pensions to expand coverage. Which is really down to 2 main factors. It's the high levels of informality in most low and middle income countries, including these 5, and also high levels of poverty, low incomes, insecure work, which make it very hard to consistently put aside money into any kind of contributory scheme. Now, this isn't to say that we should forget contributory pensions altogether, and quite the opposite. But I think that the fairly clear consensus is it's going to take quite some time to expand coverage of these systems, and we can't, if we're going to wait for those systems to expand, we're going to wait a very long time, and there are going to be many people with no pension income in old age for many decades. Now, compared to this, quite interestingly, social pensions, which are highlighted in orange there, which are non-contributory tax-financed pensions, are in most cases have actually ended up forming the largest component of coverage, as high as 85% of old people in Thailand who receive the social pension. But even in Bangladesh, Nepal, Vietnam, we're talking about 30% or so. Actually, the Philippines, just in the last few weeks, has basically the new budget for 2017 has doubled the coverage of the social pension there. So that's set to have similar levels of coverage to countries like Vietnam. Now, these schemes, the social pensions that I'll discuss, they vary quite significantly in design. They can be much more universal, like in Thailand. They can be quite narrowly means tested, like in Bangladesh and the Philippines. And or as in countries like Nepal and Vietnam, they can be universal, near universal, but often at a higher age. One thing also to highlight, which is discussed further in the report, is that the nature of coverage for men and women is quite different between contributory and non-contributory schemes. While women are less likely to benefit from contributory schemes, they are more likely to benefit from social pensions. Okay, moving to the next slide. And I think one interesting thing to highlight is, as we see, social pensions have made up quite a substantial part of the existing coverage in the 5 countries. But this is quite a new development. And what this chart shows is the coverage of social pensions in the 5 countries as a percent of older people since 1993, when the first of these countries, Thailand, introduced the social pension. If we look back to the early 90s, none of these countries had any kind of social pension, and we can see here quite dramatic increases in coverage over those years, particularly if you look at year 2008, 2009, when Nepal and Thailand both dramatically expanded their system. So it's quite a new development we're seeing. Moving to the next slide. So as I said, these schemes can be designed in different ways, they can be targeted in different ways. So who ends up benefiting from these different kinds of pensions? Social pensions, earnings-related pensions. Now, one of the clearest headlines that I think came through was that in countries where means-tested approaches are used, obviously the ambition has been that these should be an effective way of covering the very poorest people. But what we found is that this tends not to be the case. So in Bangladesh, the current scheme, and in Thailand, a historical means-tested scheme, the scheme was means-tested from 1993 to 2009. What we found with those 2 schemes was that over half of the intended recipients were excluded from that scheme. So the Thailand scheme targeted roughly the poorest 20%, around half of them, or over half of that population, were not receiving a social pension. In Bangladesh, the scheme targeting the poorest 30%, again, it appears over half were missing out, which is a major concern in terms of the effectiveness of these schemes to reach the poorest. Now, the one country with the more established universal scheme, Thailand, has shown that actually, by comparison, universal schemes are much more effective at reaching the very poorest people. The scheme in Thailand basically includes all older people, apart from those who are receiving other pensions, mainly from the government pension system, so civil servants. And what we found, and the chart to the right shows this, is actually of the poorest older people, the poorest quintile, just 4% of those households with older people were not receiving a pension. So very, very high coverage has been achieved. And in fact, it's at the higher end of the income distribution that you see more people missing out, either appears by choice or because they receive other kinds of pensions. Now, I haven't presented the charts here, but another very clear thing we see in terms of contributory pensions is that those who receive those pensions tend to be at the higher end of the income distribution. They tend to be relatively better off. Okay, moving to the next slide. So what about adequacy? How adequate are the different kinds of schemes that are in place? Now, this chart, this map here, and this visualization shows the adequacy of social pensions. Now, what the different bubbles show is the social pension benefits as a proportion of GDP per capita, so as a proportion of average income. And the map to the right shows those averages. This actually only focuses on low and middle income countries, but the averages in a few regions of the world. And what we see is in the Asia Pacific in general, benefit levels for the existing social pensions are quite a lot lower than other regions. So in Latin America and the Caribbean, we see benefits around 17%, tending to average about 17% of GDP per capita in the countries where those schemes exist. In Asia Pacific, we're talking about 11%. So in general, this is quite a well-established trend that benefit levels of existing social pensions are much lower in Asia Pacific. Now, to the right, we've got those benefit levels for the 5 countries. Now, for the Philippines, Thailand, Bangladesh, and to an extent Vietnam, these benefits are even below that regional average. So we're talking about 4 to 5% of GDP per capita, which are really very low as benefit levels for social pensions go. They're some of the lowest in the world in reality. Now, the big exception, as shown by the big red bubble, is Nepal, which actually just last year, over the last 2 years, has dramatically increased its benefit level from 500 rupees to 2,000 rupees, which is roughly $19. This means that the benefit level there is now 31% of GDP per capita, which makes it one of the more adequate social pensions by global standards by this measure. In the range of the kinds of schemes we see in Brazil and South Africa and countries like Georgia, which are also, interestingly, some of the countries where we've seen some of the biggest, most transformative impacts of social pensions and impacts on poverty and inequality. It's actually notable that in Nepal, the benefit level is, in absolute terms, higher than the benefit level in Thailand. So it's $19 in Nepal and just $17 in Thailand, despite the fact that Thailand is a significantly higher income country than Nepal. So it's interesting to see. So, I think we get the sense that Nepal, in terms of benefit level at least, is really punching above its weight. Okay, moving on to the next slide. Right, so the focus of this report, the nature of the data we were looking at, didn't provide significant opportunity really to look in depth at the impacts of these existing social pensions. So that is another area where there is a kind of growing body of evidence. But there are a couple of insights that I think are important. So the kind of caveat to the point I made in the last slide that adequacy is low is this still means that often for the very poorest older people, these benefits can be a major lifeline and can be quite life-changing. And this chart to the left shows this trend. I mean, basically what it shows is the benefit level as a proportion of household income in those households that receive it, both for the poorest people and the richest people. And what we find is that actually as a share of household income, these benefits are much higher for poorer households than they are for richer households. Similarly, for some analysis we did on a social pension scheme in Philippines, separately to this report, we were finding that amongst recipients it made up a third of household income. So the benefits can be small, but for very poor households, they can still make a major difference to their lives. Another area of impact that I think is just worth flagging is a common concern around pensions is that when we think about those kind of diverse, complex networks of family support that exist, and often this, the important support that is given from children to older people, there's a concern that, well, if we put in pensions, then somehow this will undermine that family support. It will lead to its erosion, and that will lead to older people to be in a worse situation. Now, some analysis from Thailand from the survey of older people there seems to suggest this isn't the case. And basically, what this chart shows is from 1994 to 2014, the proportion of older people who are receiving the old age allowance, which is the social pension, compared to the proportion of older people who are receiving support from children. And while we see this dramatic increase in coverage of the pension and many more people are receiving this, we don't see a change in the proportion of people receiving support from families. And other analysis done with this survey shows that the scale of that support doesn't seem to change. So this idea that it's something called crowding out, that pensions would crowd out family support, doesn't seem to be supported by the evidence. Now finally, just a couple of slides on affordability. And so to the next slide. Yeah. Now, obviously we see significant gaps in the coverage and adequacy of these social pensions, but what's the scope for expanding that coverage further? And obviously a major concern is how much will this cost, and can it be sustained, particularly in the context of population aging? Now, to explore that, what this chart shows is the cost of existing social pension schemes, both today, in 2016, and in 2040. And what's been done for 2040 is to project what would the cost of the existing social pensions be in 24 years' time if we keep the parameters the same, which basically means same age of eligibility, same kind of targeting mechanism as in the same proportion of older people receiving it, and the same benefit level measured as a share of GDP per capita. So if it's 10% of GDP per capita today, it will be 10% in 2040. Now the general picture we see is that 3 of the 5 countries have very low spending on social pensions today. Bangladesh, Philippines, Vietnam are spending 0.1% of GDP, which is really by any standards I think very low. And even with the aging of their population, if they just keep the parameters of those schemes the same, you'll be talking about 0.2% in 2040. So, I mean, the key message for those countries is, assuming there is political will to address this issue and provide income security for older people, that there would appear to be fiscal space for increasing coverage and adequacy both today and into the future. Now, Nepal and Thailand provide slightly different cases. They already currently spend much more on their social pensions, but still quite low by global standards. So they spend around half a percentage point of GDP. And it's predicted if everything just stays the same, that would increase to 1% of GDP. So on one hand, it is a doubling, and the cost would be reaching a more modest, or a more significant amount. However, it's worth putting that in context of many countries around the world spend significantly more. Bolivia, South Africa, Brazil all spend between 1% and 2% of GDP. Countries like Mauritius and Georgia spend upwards of 3 to 4% of GDP. So even that sum isn't astronomical. And similarly, there are options for both of those countries to potentially contain those costs in different ways over the years. Thailand has an age of eligibility of 60 for its old age allowance. Whether in the context of rapid population aging, it will still want to do that in 2040 is an aspect for consideration. So that in all these cases, there does appear to be, if there's that political will, space to increase the spending on these schemes in a way that would be both affordable and sustainable into the future. So just move to the next slide. So really the final side on affordability is really to emphasize some issues in terms of the earnings-related and contributory pensions. Now, it's often assumed, and often in policy discussion we see contributory pensions discussed as the kind of the solution to sustainability, that they're almost no cost, and whereas something like a social pension would be an expenditure. You have to raise taxes to pay for this. But it's not quite as simple as that, and what we see is actually some of the most significant sustainability issues in terms for these countries actually more relate currently to the contributory side. And there are kind of really 2 key elements to that. So the first one is where there are contributory social insurance schemes, usually for either private sector workers, also sometimes including public sector, like in Vietnam. Now, what we're seeing in countries like Vietnam and the Philippines is that the nature of these schemes that mean that if there isn't a reform made to them with the rapid aging of the population, then actually the funds, the balance of the funds within these schemes will run out by around the 2040s, basically because they're going to have more older people recipients and fewer workers contributing. So, unless no change is made, then eventually these funds will run out, and it will really be up to tax financing, general taxation to fund this, which is potentially quite problematic because, as we said before, the individuals who tend to benefit from these schemes are relatively better off. So the idea that then they would be supported by tax financing is not necessarily would be considered the best idea. So, the message really is that governments need to take seriously the reforms needed to make these schemes sustainable, but also make them sustainable while trying to expand their coverage and reach to more and more people. This is also quite relevant for countries like Bangladesh, which are currently at the cusp of planning to expand a new mandatory social insurance scheme. Another dimension which I think is then flagged in this infographic is something that came out quite strongly towards the end of the research, that in really almost all of the countries, more is spent on tax finance schemes for public servants than on social pensions. And these can come in various different forms. In a number of countries, in Nepal and Bangladesh, and historically in Thailand and Vietnam, the general government pension scheme was funded by taxes. And it still is in Nepal and Bangladesh. And often these are quite astronomical, quite significant sums. In Nepal, it's over 1% of GDP spent on the civil servant scheme. Bangladesh, the amount I think is about 0.5% of GDP, which is about 5 times the spending on the social pension. We found in the Philippines a number of schemes which are for specific categories, including armed forces, the police, judges, which make up about 3% of older people. That costs about 0.8% of GDP. So, compare that to the 0.1% of GDP spent on the social pension. So these are quite significant sums. Now, of course, to an extent, it's important to kind of, understand that civil servant pension schemes are, you can see them as part of the payroll of the civil service, rather than directly comparable to a social pension. However, I think what we are seeing is the scale of the expenditure and the level of the benefits that some of these categories of civil servants are receiving seem to, really raise questions about equity. If it's so affordable to, if it's perceived to be affordable to pay these levels of benefits out of tax financing to these certain categories, it questions why it might be unaffordable to pay, other forms of social protection, including social pensions. So now just moving on to the last summary slide. I won't dwell on this because it's really reiterating what's been said. But as I say, I think the key headlines are, in terms of employment, it's a mixed picture. It's neither older people as completely dependent or older people as working until they drop. And there are a number of dimensions in terms of gender and the type of work that older people do, which I think this report gives a flavour of, but at the same time I think there's more work and more analysis to be done. The second is that, older people, as I mentioned, are part of quite a complex web of family transfers that what moves within households, it moves between households. And I think when we think about social protection, and when we also think about the impacts of social protection, which I've not discussed so much, we need to understand older people within that web rather than kind of in isolation. Most older people do have family. Most older people do have some form of interaction with them. It's more about how social protection responds to the limits of those family networks and may support those family networks. So there are major gaps in the coverage and adequacy of social protection. I mentioned some of the limits of, while we need to invest in earnings-related and contributory pensions, expand their coverage to the best degree possible, there are inherent limits to how far they're going to expand. Social pensions are helping to fill that gap as a fairly new initiative, but the adequacy in the Asia region and coverage in some countries is quite low. And really the final point is, yes, that expanding adequacy and coverage of social pensions, that there are affordable and sustainable ways to do it. And in the meantime, there's a need to look at the sustainability and affordability of the contributory side, including at some of these equity issues. Okay, so that's all. And so just maybe moving to the final slide, just to say, yeah, thank you. And what I've got is a few links here to our some different sites which might be relevant if you want to know more about some of these issues. Pension Watch is a hub that HelpAge runs, which actually has a database of all social pensions in the world and lots of resources there. We've also got the main HelpAge site, and the Aging Asia site is a regional hub that HelpAge runs kind of knowledge hub on issues within that region. Also, I think in the chat box, the link to the full report, which I don't know if you can see my video, but it looks a bit like this, is going to be shared for you to download yourself if you want to know some of these trends a bit more. Okay, that's great. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Charles. And before we move on to Basil, I just wanted to recap on a bit of housekeeping, as some of you that had joined us at the beginning of this webinar may have noticed there was a bit of technical difficulties, and I had to essentially throw Charles under the bus very rapidly there to present, as we do have quite a few presenters and not so much time. So just to wrap up with that, we would love for you to give us your questions. We already have a couple that have come in. Now you can enter those into the chat box, and given the time, we might only have one round of questions, but you can direct those to the speakers, and then we can make sure that those are asked. Any questions that aren't answered, we can answer those offline and post them online at socialprotection.org. And with that, I will hand over to Basil, if we could go to the slide. Basil, can I ask you to take over that?
Yeah, thank you, Dan. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody. I'm an economist by training, and I teach economics at Dhaka University. So I don't have a slide, presentation slides, but I will speak from my notes. I'd like to start by thanking HelpAge International for giving me the opportunity to talk about on this very important and interesting work. And Charles and his team have done an excellent work, excellent analysis of very large and diverse set of data and issues. And I think we are also part of this effort, and not much to add in terms of the findings, but I think the findings are very clear, and the recommendations are also very pertinent. I have one or two issues that I will focus on from this work, and then I will talk about what could be the future look like for the older age people from a different perspective. One thing that surprised me is that that most of them actually responded that health issue are the major driver of lowering their old age work. So if I take this as a and then from this, my conclusion is that it gives some kind of implicit conclusion that there are no labor market issues for the old age worker, meaning that if an old age person wishes to work, she or she would be absorbed in the labor market. This is perhaps because most of them are working in the agriculture and also their own family-based informal activity, and I'm not sure about their own contribution into the production process. And that's why I think a deeper, further analysis needed to understand better the labor market issues related to older worker. If you can look into different sector, I think that will give a better perspective of where are they working, what are their productivity and wages and all those things compared to the working age adults between 15 to 64 years of age. Now, I think the important findings of this study is that, which is the headline, but yet common finding is that 94% of the income security of the older or old age people depends directly or indirectly on labor income. Directly means when they work, this is a direct contribution for the labor income, and they're getting a significant part from transfer. And the transfer is coming from basically children and relatives and family members. Now, I'm pretty much confident that if we look behind this or look deeper into the sources of this remitter, we'll find that most of the income is from labor. So if we take this together, I'm pretty much sure that we can say that 95% of the incomes are coming from labor income. So their income security is significantly dependent on the labor market issues and also some of those issues. And we are also working in another area where we are working with a tool called National Transfer Account, which has been used in 41 countries and it also recognized by UN. The NTA, which is the short version of that, the methodology, is an accounting framework where life cycle deficit, that means income minus expenditure of each age cohort, is calculated based on national income data for a specific country. this is available for Bangladesh, I think also Vietnam and also Thailand, part of the NTA network. Now, in most of the country, what we found that, including Bangladesh, is that the significant transfer of resources from working age to old age people. And it is higher than the children between 0 to 18, and significantly higher for old age people, that 60 plus. So this findings also corroborates with the NTA findings of Bangladesh, Vietnam, and also Thailand. Now, coming to from this conclusion, this report also tried to give future direction. Now, if I look into the future, what the future holds for the labor market is very alarming. Now, I think some of you are already aware that we are entering in a new era of production process. I think the current production process is based on like if a mix of labor, machine, and capital. And this is being replaced very fast by a new, what is some experts are calling second machine age, where the labor is being replaced by artificial intelligence with machine and capital. And this is happening quite fast, not only in the developing country, also the countries like Bangladesh and also this region. And my fear is that pretty much very soon we'll find that there are very few work for this kind of vulnerable older people and also the adult member of their family. So finding a job will be very difficult for this group of people. And if that happens, then the current pattern of old age security based on or relying on labor income will no longer be tenable. And we have to find out the alternatives. I think the alternative to me is that the state must come strongly, the government must strongly to design and implement an effective old age social pension scheme with higher coverage or comprehensive coverage and adequate transfer amount. We have done some work in Bangladesh as the Bangladesh issue came quite strongly. Charles also said that we are spending very few, small proportion of our per capita GDP to pension scheme, but we found that our analysis shows that it can be increased to 0.0% of per capita GDP in 2020, perhaps even more to 1% in 2040. But my concern is that at least in the case of Bangladesh, I think the government is not yet ready to take this issue very seriously. But I think we need to take this issue very seriously. Thank you.
Thank you, Basil. I'd just like to thank you for presenting that. Very well done without any slides. I'm not sure many people can present that coherently without visual aids. I'd like to move now on to Lisa. Lisa, if you'd like to come on and we'll move to your slides.
Great. Yep. Great. So thanks, Daniel, and hello to everybody who's joined in. That was a really interesting presentation by Charles, and I had already seen the slides beforehand, but it always helps to have someone walk you through it. What he outlined does broadly align with what we're seeing in other countries in the region, and what we thought would be most useful for me to do is not to comment directly on Charles's presentation, but to provide some reflections on what we're seeing in some of the countries in the region where DFAT works that aren't covered by the HelpAge report. So countries like Indonesia, Timor-Leste, and the Pacific. So I'm not going to go into the same level of detail as Charles did. I haven't done anywhere near the comparable level of analysis. So what follows from here is just a bit of a snapshot of some of the key points of interest. Some of the things are the same as are being seen elsewhere and as described in the HelpAge report, and some do differ. So next slide. So firstly on Indonesia, you can see from the bar chart, like Charles's figures on other parts of Asia, that Indonesia is aging. The percentage of elderly in the population, so the green part in the bars, has gone from 4.5 in 1971 to a projected 15.8% in 2035. So it's a country of 250 million people now, so this equates to a lot of over 60s in 2035, so about 48 million. At the moment, the elderly have the highest poverty rate amongst the population groups at almost 15%, and their average monthly income when working is $70 US dollars, and that compares to the average working wage of $102. Next slide. So in terms of the number of working age people available to provide resources to support older people in Indonesia, this has changed markedly. Now you can see from the slide here, in 1971 there were around 21 working age people to every one older Indonesian, and this is falling steadily. Projected in 2035 there's only going to be 6.4 working aged people for every elderly person. The HelpAge report does talk about Indonesia in this respect and mentions that the pattern of support for the elderly from the children in Indonesia, it was the same for the studied countries, but obviously it's unclear whether that's going to continue into the future. Next slide. So like in the rest of Asia, the elderly still work, especially the men and especially in rural areas. And just for clarity, the people in the red clothes just represent the average in this slide. So for example, in rural areas, 53% of the elderly people work, 71% for men, 38% for women. So yeah, elderly are still working like elsewhere in Asia. Next slide. So then with all of these poor elderly people whose numbers are predicted to grow, what social protection support do they have? And to date, not so much. As per this slide, only 11% are covered. This will likely change soon with mandatory new measures being brought in by the government, but at the moment, not so much. Next slide. So there has been no national social pension program, but luckily there is some movement on this front. There is no separate social pension program, but the national level CCT program, the Conditional Cash Transfer Program, called Program Keluarga Harapan or PKH, which means Family Hope Program, it's starting to be rolled out to the elderly. This inclusion of the elderly into a CCT program, which obviously, like other CCT programs, are normally focused on poor households with children. It's pretty rare, and I haven't heard of it happening elsewhere. So it's a poverty-targeted program, this CCT program, and it's in the process of expanding to cover more of the poor elderly, those over 70. So at the moment, 1.1 million of the 8 million elderly are under the poverty line, and those in the program receive the equivalent of US $15 a month. And this slide here shows the planned expansion. Last year, in the dark blue there, 14% of the elderly living in poverty were covered, and you can see that 2017 is going to be a big year for this program, with a plan to cover an additional 44% of the elderly under the poverty line, and then again expanding further by 2020, but not completely covering all of the elderly by then. Okay, next slide. Now I'm just going to spend a minute talking about Timor-Leste before moving on to talk about the Pacific. Timor-Leste is significantly smaller than most Asian countries, with only about 1.2 million people. But it's definitely worth mentioning because remarkably they spend more on social protection than any other Asian nation as a percentage of GDP. They introduced a pension, a relatively generous pension of $30 a month, long before their big neighbor Indonesia. and it's a country with particular demographic differences, and the most striking among them is the fertility rate of 6.95 children, which is one of the highest in the world, and higher than East Timor's fertility rate in 1975. And at the moment, 43% of the population is under 15. So despite being one of the youngest and poorest countries in the world, they have a pension covering everyone over 60, or designed to cover everybody over 60. And the World Bank studied the impact of this social, of all of the social protection programs in Timor-Leste, and found that the pension program had the biggest impact on poverty of all of the social protection programs, and it brought down the national poverty rate from 54 to 49%. At that time, the poverty rate's gone down further since. But in terms of sustainability, there may be challenges in the future as demographics change faster than the budget coffers. Life expectancy has already risen from 60 in 2001 to 68 in 2014. And if these trends continue, people are going to be on the program for much longer, making it much more expensive for the government. Next slide. Okay. Okay, now to the Pacific. So it's not often that the Pacific gets discussed at one of these social protection webinars, so I thought it was a good opportunity. As I mentioned earlier, I haven't done a comparable report to Charles for the Pacific, their HelpAge report, so I'm drawing heavily on the work of the lovely Pacific team at the World Bank. Formal social protection doesn't have deep roots in the Pacific, except for, perhaps for Fiji, but what most countries do have is a social pension, so this discussion is very relevant. Another point of interest about the Pacific is that it's not aging as quickly as Asia. The fertility decline, which drives aging in Asia, has been taking place at a much slower rate in the Pacific. Between 1975 and 2015, the Pacific had a decline from 5.6 children per woman to 3.15, which is much slower than the Asian average, which declined from 5.4 to 2.4. So like in other places, the elderly are much more likely to live in hardship than the national average, and by that I mean not being able to cover basic food and non-food needs. The current slide shows this increase in hardship with the increase in the household head's age, and you can see, maybe you can't actually, it's a bit small, but the Kiribati has a hardship incidence of 77% among elderly households. Okay, next slide. Now, normally across the globe, civil servants are the first to be covered under pension schemes, but the Pacific is an exception to this. Most countries in the Pacific have a provident fund, and only Tonga doesn't. And these provident funds are generally compulsory for both public and private sector workers aged 15 and older. And the main reason for this, so the main reason for not having separate schemes, is to keep a lid on the admin costs. So people can, if they're not in the formal sector, they can voluntarily contribute if they work so if they work in the informal sector, but this is pretty rare, normally less than 5% across the provident funds. This slide that's up now looks at social pensions across the region. They're pretty widespread. The benefit levels vary significantly, and they're not correlated with the level of development in the country. Kiribati, for example, one of the poorest countries in the region, has one of the highest benefit levels. And just finally on the Pacific, I wanted to mention traditional systems of support. This comes up in other country contexts. Oh, sorry. Sorry, that's my dog. This comes up in other country contexts, I know, but it comes up a lot in the Pacific. These traditional systems are important, but as is normally the case elsewhere, they only provide partial protection from shocks. And evidence shows that those experiencing the deepest hardship may be the least likely to be part of these well-known gift-giving networks in the Pacific. And in addition to this, sometimes cultural and social pressures can require greater levels of generosity than people can afford. And obviously these traditional systems are most definitely not robust in the face of the big covariate shocks like natural disasters, which are regularly experienced in the region. We recently did an evaluation with the World Bank of the Fiji government's top-up of their social protection system after Tropical Cyclone Winston, including their pension program. It was also topped up. And there are a couple of really fascinating findings around traditional systems of support. Firstly, poor households were not receiving transfers from any networks after the cyclone. So the top-up transfer they received from the government about a month after was the first sort of, transfer that they'd received. They hadn't received remittances as people would have expected. And secondly, those who received the transfers in the affected and the unaffected areas were not sharing them as some expected they would. Where more research is needed is whether formal transfers to the elderly in any way crowd out the informal support that they receive. There's a view in the Pacific that traditional networks will withdraw informal support if the elderly person is receiving a pension. If this is the case, obviously, then the real beneficiary of the pension is the person who previously sent the money or the goods, but that's a topic for future analysis. And it sounds like from HelpAge's work, in other countries, it looks like it's not happening there, but obviously we need some comparable analysis for the Pacific. So that's the end of the snapshot. I'll hand back to Daniel.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Thank you for that very succinct presentation of the Pacific and the very vocal outburst from the dog about informal social protection. It's appreciated. Now we have 3 questions currently for the audience that I think we have enough time to address. The first one comes from Kavem, which is about sort of micro pensions. He's not currently on, so I'll ask it for him. Now the question, I believe, is towards Charles, but also to the other 2 panelists. And that is the model of long-term savings in a micro-pension fund with a co-contribution from the government, e.g. India's national pension scheme, not more effective and efficient where awareness of an old age insecurity can be promoted and poor start saving as low as $1 per month in a safe, secured, and regulated environment? So Charles, I'll ask you to answer that first, and we have about 20 minutes for questions, so each could keep it relatively 2 or 3 minutes, 5 minutes. I know that's pretty hard. And then we have 2 more, and 1 which will come from the audience. Thank you. Charles?
Okay, yeah, let me know if you can't hear me. Okay, so on the micro pensions question, I mean, I think the main thing to emphasize is that, well, at least as I'd see it, this isn't about either or. And initiatives to support individuals in the formal sector, in the informal sector to save to the extent to which they can in, say, a micro pension or some kind of contributory scheme designed for the informal sector, I think, they're definitely positive initiatives. I think, however, maybe just to list a few concerns or limitations from the evidence, at least that I've seen globally. One is the extent to which, what is the scale of the, to what extent can this really address the problem for most people? And I mean, what we've seen and what seems to emerge, and this is a similar conclusion coming from those working at the World Bank on these kind of schemes who've done a lot of research on it, is actually there's limited record of any scheme designed for informal sector workers being able to significantly increase coverage. Yes, there are some people that can benefit, and there are some people who are able to contribute. However, the share, the scale, the number of people who can contribute sufficiently, even to get to the kind of benefit you'll be talking about with a social pension in old age, seems to be very, very small. And I think that, again, that comes down to major fundamental issues of actually people in the informal sector don't earn generally a huge amount of money. Obviously, there are some, but for the majority of the population we're talking about, earnings are quite low. Being able to make those payments consistently, even if not regularly, is tough. So there haven't really been, and there are lots of countries looking at this, and it works for some people. And I think that emphasises the importance of complementarity, and why we should see something like a micro pension as some kind of top-up to a social pension. Indeed, one thing we really want to avoid, which some social pension design does, is that an individual breaks their back saving into some kind of micro pension or small savings scheme for an informal sector worker, then finally reaches old age, and because they've got a bit of savings, gets excluded from the social pension because they're seen to have an alternative income. I think that the kind of perverse incentives that would create would be problematic. Now, I mean, in terms of effectiveness, the point was raised about the role of co-contributions from government or somebody else. And I think, yeah, the evidence is that if you want to expand coverage, then that's going to work a lot better if then there is a co-contribution from government. Again, I don't think there's huge evidence of that leading to dramatic increases in coverage, though it can to an extent. And I think one question of co-contribution, one issue that one has to look at is the potential for that to be a regressive policy. So if at the end of the day you're only slightly increasing coverage and you are really only able to help those people who are at the richer end or the less poor end of the informal sector, then it may be your co-contribution is effectively a tax finance cash transfer to people around the middle to the top of the income distribution. So, one has to ask the question, well, if one's going to make a tax finance cash transfer to anyone in the population, why would it be to those people who are relatively less poor? Specifically targeted them effectively. And I guess the last point to make is around this being safe and a safe and secure form of saving, and being able to kind of ensure that individuals can have trust that they'll get their money at the end of the day. I mean, obviously, where these informal schemes are run through some kind of government system, then the likelihood that the savings will come back to the individual are higher. I think it's slightly more worrying where you see micro pensions being run by NGOs without that regulatory framework, because effectively a micro pension has to be able to hold money for quite a long period of time, and you don't want that to we need to know what would happen if the NGO ceases to exist, or if there's corruption or whatever, who takes responsibility and who foots the bill. And I guess just the final point, I mean, seeing a social pension as a cure rather than prevention, I mean, there is some evidence that actually suggests social pensions may be part of the contribution to the prevention as well. So linking back to this question, we're talking, as I discussed earlier, a lot of the families we're talking about expected to provide support to older people are struggling with multiple priorities, including, as you were mentioning, how to save for their own old age, how to make sure they have sufficient enough assets or savings for their own old age. Now, actually having a social pension in place and a broader supportive social protection system and decent services takes the pressure off those individuals of working age, so they can actually think about saving for the future rather than just the immediate needs of today. And a social pension, I'd say, is part of that picture of taking the pressure off wider families.
Thank you for that, Charles. Basil and Lisa, I'm not sure if you want to come in on that. We do have a few more questions coming in, so if you don't have any comments, we can move on to that. But please do let us know if you'd like to answer that question as well regarding micropensions. Okay, well, I guess then we will actually take a question from the audience. Caitlin would like to ask a question for Lisa. So I'll go ahead and Caitlin and unmute you now if you'd like to go ahead and speak. Caitlin?
Yeah, yes, hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so my question was just about that CCT program in Indonesia that you were sharing about, the Family Hope program. And I was wondering if you knew how the decision was made to include those over 70. Was it the result of advocacy or in response to data that was shared from household surveys or something else?
Thank you for that. Lisa, would you like to come in there?
Sure. Sorry, I was just working out the tech. Hold on. Yeah. Thanks, Caitlin. Yes, I mean, the elderly, for a long time, coverage of the elderly has been really conspicuous in its absence, and I mean, the data clearly shows that that the elderly are some of the poorest in Indonesia, and so it really was a very big hole in the social protection system and remains such, but there is positive movement. So I guess the decision wasn't whether they should be covered. They had the government got the data, knows that they should be covered. The question then was, well, how, and would they roll out, I guess, a social pension or a separate poverty-targeted pension program, or will they expand their CCT program? I guess I wasn't expecting the latter option to play out, but that's the route that they've chosen to expand coverage to include the elderly into the CCT program. They've also decided to expand coverage to include the people with a disability into the CCT program too. Yeah.
Great, thanks for that. We have another question for Lisa, actually, so don't go away just yet. We have a question for Tasni regarding what you brought up previously. Tasni, would you like to go ahead and ask your question now? Don't know if we've got Tasni there. Hello, Tasni, you're unmuted if you'd like to speak. Well, while we're waiting for that, we do have another question from Alicia, which was in regard to the being a very good report. However, her question is whether or not there's any suggestions on how to address sustainability issues related to social pensions. And I believe, Charles, that's more directed to you. Social pensions in the countries that have been studied in sustainability.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. No, thanks. I think that's a very good point, and yeah, I mean, it's something we've looked at in a number of countries. I mean, maybe just to set out I think the basic options. I mean, if you've got an existing scheme and you're looking at the future cost of it, there are basically three areas you can address to look at, containing the cost and trying to kind of keep it stable. Again, I mean, I guess the broader context is what is sustainable links to what is a proportionate response to an issue and how much, as a society, as a country, you want to spend on it, which is more of an open question. But, I mean, look at the question, let's say you want to kind of sustain the cost of the existing scheme. I mean, number one is what you do at the benefit level. So, there you have the options. You can either keep it the same, relative to average wages and incomes, which was similar to what we did in those simulations. We were saying, if something were 25% of GDP per capita today, that's what it would be in 2040. Now that's quite a generous way to index benefits, and is not usually done systematically. In fact, most of the countries we're talking about here, and most of the countries with social pensions, really increase benefits in a fairly ad hoc way. A second option is to increase your benefits to prices. So we're not going to try and keep them the same to wages, but we can keep them the same relative to prices, inflation, and that will mean they keep their real value, but maybe don't keep pace with the increasing incomes of a country. I mean, what we found from our a lot of the work we've done is actually, even in the context of population aging, often if you just keep your benefit at, the same in terms of, if you just index it to inflation, actually the costs remain fairly stable, because effectively your economy, the growth of your economy is compensating for the growth in the older population. And that's something, for example, I think one might see a country like Nepal could do. Its benefit level is quite high relative to average income, 31% of GDP per capita. Perhaps what it could look to do to sustain costs into the future would be to, actually just index it to inflation. It will keep its real value, but it will decrease slightly relative to the average incomes of a country over time. And then it also might help Nepal to look at some of the coverage issues. Currently, our scheme is only mainly for older people aged 70 and over, which is quite a high age for a country like Nepal. Obviously, another thing you can look at is the age of eligibility, and I think this is quite a serious option that many countries should be considering, particularly in the Asia region. I mean, as long as it's done in a predictable way and a measured way, I think increasing the ages of eligibility for pensions can be quite a pragmatic option that still means your scheme is able to have very positive impacts, provide that level of income security. So say Thailand has a low benefit level, but also a low age of eligibility. I think a priority is to increase that adequacy, but it could also be looking as a way to contain costs, to increase that age from 60 to 65 over time, which is, I think, if we look by international standards, would be quite reasonable for a country with the size of the older population that Thailand has. And the final thing is, I mean, the other option is whether you kind of exclude certain people who have other pensions or reduce the benefit, and you can also look to claw back money from richer people. So, actually, a country like New Zealand, which has a pure universal pension, everyone over 60 with certain residency requirements, 65, sorry, receives that pension. But what they do is the way they use the tax system means that they actually claw back a lot of that income through the tax system from richer pensioners, so the actual cost of the scheme is less than it is on the face of it. Similarly, you can exclude some pensioners, richer pensioners, from a social pension scheme. I think a little bit of care is needed with that, just because we also have this objective of increasing contributory capacity, and what we want to avoid is creating perverse incentives where you might be saying, well, if you've done the good thing and contributed and saved your old age, we're now going to reward you by taking away the social pension from you. That doesn't send a very good message. I mean, it's an issue that I know has been quite significant in countries like Australia and South Africa, that kind of cliff edge of no longer receiving the tax finance social pension. So that's something to look out for. But if you can do it in a way that maintains the effectiveness of the system and maintains that universal floor and maintains adequacy, then I think that's also an option that's on the table.
Definitely. Thank you very much, Charles, for that. Now we've got Tassini back on the line, and I'll just unmute. Tassini, would you like to go ahead and ask your question? I believe it was for Lisa. I think there might be a bit of a feedback problem with you.
Hello?
Okay, I think we may have a small problem with the echo there, Tassini. I'm not sure. I've muted you a bit just to see if we can fix it by unmuting. Okay.
Hello, can you hear?
Okay, well, I will ask Tassini's question for her, and I hope I get this correctly until we fix those problems. The question is, coverage of social pensions do not reduce support from children, and this is towards Lisa, I believe. What about its impacts on level of work and old age? Additionally, spending on social pensions as a percentage of GDP seems low, but it could be high in relation to the government's revenue. Are there any comments on either of these issues? And Lisa, I will direct those to you.
Okay. Yeah, I would be very happy if the analysis in the Pacific showed the same findings as the Getting Out of Asia, in that the social pensions are not impacting on transfers from family members. In terms of work and the impact on work, I guess, yeah, I think we would all be perfectly happy if work levels went down, and I don't have the data from the countries I was speaking about, but I guess I do have an interesting anecdote from Timor when I was there recently, and we were talking about the old age pension and how well it had done in terms of, especially relative to some of the other programs, in terms of bringing down the poverty levels. But it happened a couple of times in different meetings where people brought up, yeah, I mean that's all well and good, but the elderly in the villages, when you went out to villages, they used to grow the tomatoes, and you could buy the tomatoes on the side of the road, and that's how they made their, and they're not doing that anymore, and it's hard to get these great tomatoes that the elderly used to grow. So yeah, it was interesting. I mean, they weren't, I guess, implying that the elderly were now becoming lazy and independent, but it was very new to people that that the elderly would stop working or wind down working and not have to go sell tomatoes on the side of the road, and that could actually be a desirable thing, and maybe somebody else could start growing the tomatoes and selling the tomatoes. Sorry, what was the second part of the question?
Yes, the second part of the question was in relation to the GDP, which was spending on social pensions as a percentage of GDP seems low, but it could be high in relation to government's revenue. And she wanted to comment on that.
Right. No, and she is right. And sorry, I don't have those figures in front of me, but I can get back to Tasni on that one. Sorry.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, this is quite a specialized question and specialized audience, so they were a bit loaded. We've actually kept time quite well. We are currently at the end of our webinar, and I'd like to thank everyone for joining. I'd like to thank our panelists for presenting an excellent presentation, and hopefully everyone will download the report and read it tonight over dinner. Thank you again for joining socialprotection.org, and we do hope that you will become part of socialprotection.org. And if you could, stay on and fill out the survey for them so they can tell what they can improve or what they're doing well. It's always useful to have some feedback and some evaluation, as we all know. And we will leave it there, and hope to see everyone soon.